for joining us for this episode of Talking Health in the 406, where we are one community under the big sky. I'm Trina Filan, a public health evaluator for diabetes and cardiovascular health projects.
And I'm Margaret Mullins, the Social Determinants of Health Program Manager.
Our guest today is Robert Belle, the supervising attorney for medical legal partnerships at the Montana Legal Services Association. We'll probably refer to that as MLSA throughout the podcast, so you know there's an abbreviation. Robert will be talking with us today about the work MLSA does to protect Montanans' legal determinants of health, particularly related to housing. Welcome, Robert.
Thank you for having me. Good morning.
I got the idea to invite MLSA to the podcast because I'm on a listserv for libraries, and one of your colleagues sends regular legal tips for libraries to share with their patrons. These legal tips made us realize that we hadn't really covered legal services as important for supporting and protecting people's health. Robert, before we get into legal determinants of health, can you tell our audience about Montana Legal Services Association, what it does, how long it's been around, and who it serves?
Montana Legal Services Association is a nonprofit legal aid law firm in Montana, and we serve individuals with low income throughout the state in a variety of different areas. MLSA has been around for, I think, 60 years. It's a long time, and we have lots of different programs and attorneys that serve clients throughout the state. My project with the Medical Legal Partnership encompasses several different partnerships. I have cases that come through me with a partnership with Providence St. Patrick Hospital in Western Montana. And how that works basically is that Providence and medical providers, or sometimes the social workers, will refer patients of theirs to Montana Legal Services who have civil legal needs. And maybe that's a good point to kind of clarify what we do, that MLSA does not do any criminal law. We do civil law, and we generally don't take any cases that are fee generating. For example, a car accident case where you might sue the other driver or the insurance company. We don't do those sort of things, but we do a variety of other civil legal issues. Some of the big ones for us are housing or landlord-tenant kinds of cases, family law cases, divorces, and parenting plans. We have a lot of consumer cases as well, issues related to debt or debt collection or foreclosure or things like that. But we also can do a lot of other things related to public benefits. And that might be issues with Medicaid and Medicare, Social Security, SNAP, things like that. But also just kind of anything else that might be kind of civil. Legal aid might fall under our ambit. And our medical legal partnerships are general practice groups in which we might address any of these potential issues. But housing winds up being a big one for us, might be 30 to 40% of our cases. We have a series of medical legal partnerships, one with Providence St. Patrick Hospital and outpatient clinics, and also St. Joseph Hospital in Olson. And we also have the Montana Health Justice Partnership, which is a partnership between MLSA, a number of federally qualified health centers throughout the state, the Montana Primary Care Association, as well as the Consortium of Urban Indian Health Centers. And the model with all of these MLPs is that a healthcare provider will meet with patients and screen for certain social or sometimes legal issues and refer them to us for services.
Great. That's a really good overview of things.
Yeah, you guys do a ton of stuff. Robert, I have one clarification. When you said you serve lower income folks, do you have like a criteria or a definition for what that lower income level is?
Yes. So that's generally tied to the federal poverty line, and different programs within MLSA might have different criteria. And some programs actually don't have any cap at all. But for the most part, we're looking at people who are about 125% of the federal poverty line or below, or up to 200% of the federal poverty line, with some deductions for living expenses. That's generally the ballpark that we're looking at. But again, there are certain programs where there might be exceptions to that.
All of that gets me thinking of a lot of questions to ask you. But I'm going to start first. I guess I'd first like to provide a little bit of context. Here in the Chronic Disease Prevention and Health Promotion Bureau, we work with healthcare providers and community-based organizations to address both the medical and non-medical needs of Montanans. And when we think about non-medical needs, we often think about access to food, transportation, and housing first. We've had some discussions in other podcasts about food and nutrition, local housing needs, and the connection between housing and health. Today, we're going to talk about the importance of low-barrier legal services to maintaining fair and safe housing for both tenants and landlords. So, Robert, I don't think many of our listeners have heard that term, legal determinants of health, before. The resources that we consider related to social determinants of health need the support of legal services to ensure everyone has equitable access to them. Can you just talk a little about this concept of legal determinants of health and how Montana Legal Services Association addresses them?
Sure. I think that there's more and more research that is showing that the majority of what determines a person's health isn't necessarily what happens at the doctor's office. It isn't necessarily what medication they take, or their genetics, or even necessarily their behavior, but it has to do with complex social and environmental factors that make up someone's life. One way of even framing it is Maslow's hierarchy of needs, where housing is foundational, right? And it's your environment, it's where you live, it's who you associate with, it's also your education, it's the food that you eat or have access to, as you noted. It's all of these other things that are outside of the doctor's office. And, as a legal aid firm, there are things that we do that kind of intersect with a lot of these needs. Sometimes it's framed as social determinants of health or legal determinants of health. I might use those terms interchangeably. As a lawyer, I'm inclined to see problems as legal problems. If you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. But another way of framing all of this is social determinants or social drivers of health. If we're talking specifically about housing, I think that safe, decent, and affordable housing is the cornerstone for a healthy, happy, and productive life, because shelter or housing is one of the most basic human needs that a person has. Our home is our physical foundation, and it's something that if we're stably housed, I think we can take for granted all of the things that it provides us. It's shelter from the elements. Now that it's winter and snow is falling outside, it might seem more obvious, right, that we have a dry and warm place to live. Our home is a place to eat and prepare meals. It's a place to sleep. It's a place where we have privacy, where we share time with our families, where we have intimacy, where we entertain ourselves. Basically, everything we can and want to do in private life happens in our home. And so if there are any issues with that, right, that can have a profound impact on your health. If there's mold in the house, that has an obvious effect on your health. Or, a forced move or an eviction can take all of that away from a person. And, if we just think about it as a legal issue and something we have to solve, that's one thing. But there are cascading problems if there's an issue with someone's house. And ultimately, what might happen is, somebody shows up at the doctor's office, and they have a cough, or they have stress, or they have a crisis that's manifested because of something or some series of things that have happened out in the world. And so the doctor might try to treat the medical issue, and perhaps they're successful in that, but there are other issues outside that can be dealt with in other ways or have other causes.
So it's very complex, as you've noted. And I don't think that people tend to think about the repercussions of maybe unsafe or inadequate housing, or, as you say, a forced move. Sometimes it's viewed as just this thing that happened, or you have to just deal with this. But there are lots of lead-on effects, as you've said, that can come from these kinds of problems with housing. So a couple of questions. What are some of the health issues that you've seen come up, especially related to housing, that you all know are exacerbated because of housing issues? And then also, when you help people with those issues, do you ever bring in partners or, work with physicians or whomever to, or other groups to help alleviate those add-on effects?
Yes. So I should also say, of course, I'm a lawyer, but I'm not a medical provider. So I might know enough about medicine to sound like a fool to anyone who's bona fide in that profession. But we do see lots of health issues, and some of the big ones, mold, or there might be respiration issues if the air is difficult to breathe, if there's issues with heat, if it's too cold in the winter, if it's too hot in the summer, right? That can have a profound impact on somebody's health, and a number of other issues. And a big one is stress. Being evicted is enormously stressful. Living someplace where you're in a dispute with your neighbors or with your landlord is enormously stressful. Everybody knows, how profound the impact of stress is on your health. And I think also, a lot of the people that we serve, show up already with chronic health issues. I think it's more common for people, low-income people, to have more chronic health issues. And I'm sure you guys know more about that than I do, right? But issues related to trauma and mental stress, but also people with disabilities, people with chronic health issues. People come into the situation with health issues, and they can be exacerbated by unsafe conditions, or they can be exacerbated by disputes, forced moves, things like that. As far as working with physicians, the model that we have with MLP is that there are corresponding authorizations to communicate back and forth about a case. And so, lawyers have confidentiality rules, so do physicians, right? So it's not to say that a patient is referred from the hospital to us and I get access to their whole medical record and I get to monkey around with any of that. It's not like that, but there gets to be communication back and forth. The patient or the client will authorize that sort of communication. And one way that's at least very helpful is to try to bolster communication. It's another way to try to connect with someone. Something that's very common in the work that we do is we can struggle to make contact with people or maintain contact with people. Somebody might be referred, or somebody might apply for our services. We try to get in touch with them. Maybe there's an issue with their phone. Maybe they're busy. It happens often. But at some point, they're going to have to go to the doctor, right? And or they have another appointment, right? And so there's another point of contact that allows us to try to stay in touch with people and coordinate services and things like that.
I think that that's a really interesting point that you bring up, because we deal with that here in our bureau a lot. We work with providers, and they will have patients come in for a medical need. But often these days, providers are screening their patients for certain social drivers of health, and they will refer them if there's a need. And following up on that process is a really, really important step. So bidirectional referrals is what we call them, so that a patient gets referred, but then the physician also follows up to make sure the patient went. And it sounds like you're doing very similar things. And the more people you have sort of working on behalf of that patient or that person that you're assisting, obviously the better. And I am a little curious if you have found over maybe the last few years. I can imagine when you were doing this initially and talking to providers, there may have been, I don't know that I would say less receptive, but maybe providers weren't as accustomed to serving their patients outside of the healthcare setting. But I'm curious if you have seen that become a much more natural process in what you do.
I think around the country, medical legal partnerships have been around for a long time, but they are becoming more and more common. I think what we've heard is an idea among the medical community of, oh no, lawyers, we're getting sued, or there's some issue, right? There's a medical malpractice thing, and or there's some kind of hackles get up, or there's perhaps a defensiveness, and I think that's lessened to some degree. Because for one thing, we don't do medical malpractice, right? We're not here to try to, sue doctors for not meeting the standard of care with patients. What we're trying to do is, serve patients in other ways. And what we've seen over time with providers that are able to utilize our service with patients is that it takes some of the things that they're dealing with off their plate. And the way that it's framed sometimes is trying to allow everybody to work at the top of their license. So a patient might show up at their clinic with a social issue, and they might have to try to address it, even though that's not really what their job is, right? They're trained to treat the medical issue, right? But if you can refer pieces of that out to people who are trained to do it, who it is within their bailiwick to deal with those other issues, it allows everybody to try to do what they're really trained to do. And I think that the providers who've been able to utilize these services, they see the value in that, and they're relieved to be able to have that service that they can kind of get off their plates and provide a better service. As I said, I'm not a doctor. I can't diagnose or treat anybody's anything, right? I can't tell someone that they have diabetes or what they need to do about it. But I can help someone with diabetes, access their SNAP benefits or other things like that. Allowing people to do what they're really trained to do, I think is one of the great benefits. And I think people who use it are becoming more receptive to that.
That's a great explanation. I think that you have a lot of people, the more people you have in the mix that can service those patients, and that, interlocking web of factors, you've explained it really well. That's necessary sometimes to service what a patient actually needs. And I guess one of my next questions for you is talking about that web of factors, about health and housing. I'd like to discuss, or have you discuss, some of the problems that can arise regarding housing specifically, especially rentals, some of the things that can come up.
And we have a whole list of different possibilities.
Sure.
Maybe we can just go down this list and see what pops up.
Yes, let's do that.
Sounds good.
So, for example, you touched on forced moves, and people can have housing instability for a whole bunch of reasons. And eviction is one of those reasons, right? So would you be willing to talk about eviction and eviction prevention from your perspective?
There are a number of reasons why an eviction might happen. I think when we describe it in terms of eviction, it's a process that the landlord has started, versus the tenant, voluntarily trying to move, and why I might sometimes not call it eviction, but a forced move. One of the common issues is that rent is late or not paid. Another basis for eviction might be a violation of the lease. We live in a community, in a state, in Missoula in particular, where I am, but also throughout Montana, where the cost of housing is very high, and the supply of affordable housing is lower than what the population needs. At least in Missoula, the median rental price is more than what the typical family in this community can afford. Financial experts say that you should be spending about a third of your income on housing, and the median rental income is higher than what that is for Missoula in particular. And I think other communities throughout the state are similar, which means that combined with the notion that most Americans are living paycheck to paycheck already, it's very easy for people to get behind on their rent. Not paying rent is a perfectly legitimate reason to force the tenant out of the rental, and so that's a very common reason that happens. And unfortunately, there's not really a defense to that. The statute is fairly clear that if rent is owed, the landlord can force the tenant out and get possession of their rental back to them. And really, the only defense there is to try to work something out. And sometimes landlords are willing to do that. I think actually, oftentimes they are, to work out a payment plan. So, I owe X amount. We'll pay back that, a little bit over time, or something like that. There used to be, for a few years, emergency rental assistance funds that were administered through the state. This was kind of a result of some of the COVID things. There's money available to pay back rent, to pay other sorts of things. All that money is dried up. There are small charities that I think here and there, little pockets of money that they have sort of emergency rental assistance that can help people pay back rent, or also get into new rentals and pay security deposits and first month rent and things like that. But really, the only defense to being late on rent is trying to work out a payment plan, or maybe some money shows up somewhere. Another way that somebody can be forced out of their rental is if there's a violation of the lease. And there could be a number of reasons for that. A lot of people have a rental agreement. I don't know that anybody's read all the terms of it, but there's lots of stuff in there. Lots of things that you're agreeing to do or not to do. And I don't think people always realize what's in their rental agreements. But it could be, having an unauthorized guest. It could be, there are other sorts of rules that a landlord might impose that might be broken. And there are also rules kind of laid out in statute about what a landlord's obligations are and what a tenant's obligations are. And one thing that happens sometimes is perhaps a landlord has reason to believe that a tenant is damaging the unit. Perhaps they're not maintaining the premises in the way that a tenant's supposed to, or, causing damage or something like that. And I think what can also happen is that perhaps a tenant will complain about the need for repairs. Oh, the stove's not working, or the furnace is out. Or maybe there's mold. And that is the landlord's duty to fix. And some landlords, when they realize how expensive it is to fix a tenant's problem, they try to find a way to force them out. And there are provisions in the law that prevent a retaliatory eviction like that. But to raise that sort of defense usually requires some knowledge of what the laws are and some ability to advocate for oneself or get a lawyer who can do that for you.
You just mentioned repairs, and you got me thinking a little bit. Obviously, eviction, just a huge topic in the rental community. But also, one of your colleagues, Amy Hall, she gave a presentation to our asthma home visitors on mold and lead and drafts. And so when you talk about repairs, I wondered if you could just talk a little bit more about those kinds of problems and the resources that are available to help.
So, and I'm familiar with that presentation. Amy Hall has been doing this work for a very long time. And, she knows more about housing law in Montana than just about any, as far as I can tell. The basic structure of the law is that the landlord has a duty to maintain property and make sure that it complies with applicable housing and building codes, and to keep the property in a fit and habitable condition, make sure that common areas are clean and safe, make sure that all electrical, plumbing, heating, ventilating, air conditioning, and other appliances are in good working order, supply reasonable running water, and also provide heat between October and May, garbage containers, maintain the common areas, things like that. But tenants also have corresponding duties. Tenants have a duty to maintain the premises, to not damage the premises, to not engage in criminal activity on the premises. And so there are corresponding rights and duties of each.
Robert, can you talk a little bit more about if you have this information available, where can both tenants and landlords find out more about their rights and obligations? Because it's a relationship, right? You're entering into a relationship that is mutual, should be based on trust and, this mutuality of responsibility. But sometimes folks don't fully appreciate all of that stuff, don't appreciate how to address those issues if the relationship is not being met on either side. That relationship is really important to maintain, right? So are there resources for each party? And also, do you have any recommendations for maintaining a good relationship? Communication, that kind of stuff.
Yes, and these are good questions. And one great source for resources is our website, montanalawhelp.org. There are a lot of short FAQs, also form letters to be used in certain circumstances, also linked on our website, and I can share this with you as well. Vermont PIRG has put out a landlord tenant guide, which is pretty comprehensive, kind of going over just a nice overview of all the applicable law. And I should acknowledge that my role is a tenants counsel, right? So my perspective might be different than perhaps somebody else's, right? I am also a renter myself, and in my work, in my professional life, what I see are the circumstances where something has gone wrong for a tenant, and there is a crisis, there is an issue to address. What I don't see in my professional life are all the circumstances where there were no issues or everything went well, where the relationship between landlord and tenant was good. And I've had some landlords personally that we had a great working relationship. Had some issues with tenant landlords personally where things kind of got off the rails. But as far as trying to maintain that good working relationship, I think having some knowledge of each person's corresponding rights and duties is important. Maintaining open communication can be important and can mitigate some issues. I think oftentimes when an issue is elevated to crisis level is because communication has failed, and nobody's talking anymore. Nobody's willing to work through issues, especially if there's an issue regarding a need for repairs. There's a process to kind of address those. What the law contemplates is that you provide proper notice in writing about any sort of issue. And I think what happens a lot of times is that landlords and tenants communicate more informally. It's like, oh, the faucet's running, just call me or just text me. Or next time landlord's coming around the property, you just talk to them. You just have a conversation. And for a lot of circumstances, that works really well. Where you have a responsive landlord, you have a tenant who's communicating in a mature way, and sort of informal communication like that in person, or over the phone, that works really well. Also, what's becoming more common now with bigger property management companies is a lot of them are using online portals, or things like that for people to make requests for repairs on the online portal. They also will pay the rent through there. You can see notices on there. I think that there are some issues with those. Sometimes it's more convenient, or it's easier to be able to just fill out an online form, or just maybe you have an automatic deposit that goes into the online portal for your rent or something, and it's easier. The issue with those is sometimes they can be less personal, and with some of these property management companies, it's impossible to get a real person on the phone to talk to them about issues. And sometimes these softwares don't really work very well, or there are little wrinkles, like any software anywhere, right? There can be issues with that can make things more difficult. Again, circling back to the law, which was written, 50 years ago, it wasn't contemplating online portals, and it wasn't contemplating texting or even emailing. None of those things existed when the law was drafted. It contemplated writing on paper to provide notice of a lot of things, which I'll say that if you are very interested in creating a paper trail, that you provide notice of something in writing. If a landlord wants to access the unit on a given day, it's a letter in writing. A text might suffice, but you really want to, have a good paper trail. It's a letter. Same thing with the request for repair. You can call the landlord and say, the faucet's running, but what's better in terms of proving it later is a letter in writing. And again, what that sets up a situation where maybe there's a fight later that has to go to court, and you have to prove what happened. There's a lot clearer evidence if there's a paper trail than phone calls.
Thank you. That's really good information. And your discussion of online portals made me think about patient portals that are popping up everywhere for healthcare systems, right? These portals have pros and cons. And sometimes the con for a patient portal is that older folks or folks with disabilities may not have as easy a time getting on to that, that mode of communication, and may need a different way of doing business, which isn't maybe how the healthcare system or the management company is willing to operate. So this is a windy pathway to me asking, how often do you come across issues with landlords or with housing in general that bumps up against the needs of people with disabilities or older folks, people with some particular needs? How do you support those?
Well, on the online portal discussion, if I had $1 for every time a client said, "I don't know nothing about computers," I would have several dollars. It's a very common thing, not just older clients or patients, but perhaps people with limited education have issue navigating the online world that we all are living in or are forced to live in. And there's often not a great way of dealing with it. Somebody who's more tech savvy or more accustomed to the online tools of the day will say, "Oh, it's easy. You just get online and you do the thing and you click on the button and then it's done." But that's pretty overwhelming for a lot of people. And what they'd rather do is just go into the office and talk to somebody. So there's a rub there. As far as serving clients with disabilities, there are ways, perhaps housing accommodations, like landlords are required if they have a certain number of units to comply with the Fair Housing Act, which means accommodating certain disabilities or making certain changes to the rental or the rental agreement to allow someone with disabilities to have access to the rental. Again, on the topic of online portals, we've had colleagues who have requested on behalf of clients that perhaps they don't have to use that system to coordinate with their landlord, that notices be provided a different way. Maybe notices be provided in writing or something like that. People with learning issues might have, or memory issues might have issue talking over the phone as well, right? So you can talk to them on the phone and they might say, "Oh, yeah, sure," but then 2 days later they've forgotten. So they need the writing, and writing perhaps in a particular way to be able to understand what's happening and remember it later. We've also had circumstances where somebody's on a fixed income because their sole source of income is perhaps Social Security disability. And those payments come on a certain day of the month, the same day every month, which might not align with the day that rent is due. So we have some circumstances requested an accommodation to allow a disabled tenant to pay rent at a time that better corresponds with when they get their disability benefit. There might also be circumstances where, it's more of a question about the rental, itself, right? If someone is wheelchair bound, there are certain things that are going to be necessary for them to be able to move around their house. Or if somebody is blind, right? There are different things that might be requested to better accommodate that person's needs. Those are a few examples. I guess the big one that also comes up, the emotional support animals, those are actually one of the most common ones, or service animals. We get a lot of requests about those. Essentially, the process for that is that if someone has some diagnosed medical issue, they can ask for a reasonable accommodation from their landlord to allow them to have a certain animal for a certain purpose. Dogs and cats are probably the most common. The rules on that are that it's no hardline rule about what pet might be allowed and don't, or for any other accommodation. There's no hardline rule brand list of, you have this issue, you can get this accommodation. It all comes down basically to some level of reasonableness. That, if someone has a mental disorder, and their medical provider believes that they would benefit from having a pet, a service animal, or an emotional support animal, they can get a letter from a medical provider documenting the need for that animal and how that will allow them to basically the fair use of a rental property. And again, there's no bright line rule about, this animal is good or that animal is bad. It's not that yes, a horse is too much, but a chinchilla is fine. Comes down to reasonableness. And like I said, most of the time it comes down to usually people are asking for dogs or cats.
You've talked about some of the legal logistics around, changes to rental agreements and security deposit issues and how having a paper trail is really beneficial. What advice do you have for listeners to make sure that some of those potential challenges get handled correctly beyond the paper trail and some of the steps that they take in the process of trying to get answers? What happens next? What do I do if my paper trail is leading me still to unanswered questions and conflict? Where do I go?
Someone can reach out to an attorney, whether that's Montana Legal Services Association or another, about kind of next steps. With regard to requests for repairs, there is a process that if you've requested a repair and in your request, the law sets out certain timelines for that request to be honored. If it's not, the tenant has a couple of options. They can, in some circumstances, make the repair themselves and deduct the cost of the repair from their rent, as long as it's under a certain amount. They can choose to terminate their rental. In either case, there might be an opportunity for a lawsuit for damages if the other party doesn't comply with what they want. But again, the other answer to your question is yes, they can be referred to Montana Legal Services Association for advice on next steps, or another attorney to potentially talk about what they could do, and that might be court action.
Okay. Which I'm sure everybody would like to avoid. So let's think about all of those other processes before something like that has to happen.
When we've talked about stress, the stress of these issues, going to court is enormously stressful. And it also might not get the outcome that somebody wants. The judicial system is sort of limited in the kinds of remedies that it offers, and they tend to be all or nothing kinds of outcomes. You win or you lose. You're owed money or you're not. Landlord gets possession or they don't. It's kind of a lot of one or zero kinds of outcomes, and it's very stressful to go through court, and it could also be costly. It's costly for, well, what we do, we're a nonprofit, so our clients don't have to pay us anything in terms of the services we provide. If a landlord has to hire an attorney, they're going to want to be paid. So there's cost involved, there's time involved, there's stress involved, but also, like I say, you take the issue out of your own hands, so to speak, and you put it in a judge's hands to make the resolution. And if you don't take that step, and you can sometimes have a better craft a better outcome for yourself if you're able to work it out with the parties. Of course, if one or both parties are being unreasonable, there's no prospect of resolution. That's really what court is for. Going back to trying to maintain relationships, trying to work things out, informally to try to resolve things rather than escalating to this point where it's in the judge's hands to, one way or the other. And that's what it's going to be.
Robert, one other thing that is probably a big can of worms to open up, but we think it would be worthwhile to talk about is subsidized housing. Do you have any input to help people with their applications? Do you have any guidance that you offer people? Because the process of getting even onto a list to get into subsidized housing is quite a lot, right? There's a big process. So what kinds of input do you give people for that kind of housing?
Sure. What I'll say is that there are many different kinds of subsidized housing. There are many different kinds of vouchers for different people and different kinds of rentals. And so I might not comment on the specifics of any one of them. But that is a service that we can provide, and we have people on staff here who are experts in different kinds of subsidized housing. And each program presents unique rules that might go above and beyond what the Landlord Tenant Act says. So we do have people that can advise on particular issues. There are, for example, sometimes extra protections for somebody who's in a given kind of subsidized housing, notices that are specific notices that are required for certain actions. It can all get fairly complicated. Also, the people that qualify for subsidized housing, I think the stakes are higher for them because these programs are generally attached to some income level or resource level, and for them to lose that subsidized housing can be the stakes can be much higher for them because of who they are to begin with, right? If you're a disabled person who's on a fixed income and who has a housing voucher where your rent is connected to the amount of income that you have, which is fixed because of your disability, to lose that voucher and to be, forced into more of a market rent situation can be catastrophic because that person can't afford market rent. Just an example, I might have a client who receives $1,200 a month in Social Security disability. They might be in a subsidized housing rental where they pay a third of their income on housing, which they can afford. But if they lose that voucher and they're trying to find market rent, $1,200 is, most places are more expensive. It's going to be very hard to find that sort of place. So we do try to prioritize serving clients that are in subsidized housing because the stakes for them to lose that are very high.
You have given us such a great overview of the different issues and topics that come up for both renters and landlords. I think you've really laid out a good picture, and there are many challenges that arrive. And it's also clear to me that the Montana Legal Services Association really provides a lot of assistance to people who may need it, which is great. And I'm wondering, are people able to access your services from anywhere in Montana?
Yes, and I don't want it to sound more complicated than it is, but there are a couple different ways that people can access our services. We have a website where people can apply online. We have a phone number that people can call and apply online. Anywhere in the state, anybody can apply. With our medical legal partnerships, though, we have a bit of a different model where to receive services from our group, we take referrals directly from the healthcare providers that we have partnerships with. So, for one of my clients, they might interact with a social worker at St. Pat's Hospital who fills out a referral form, and that comes directly to me. It doesn't go through our general MLSA intake. And the same thing for our other partnerships with our fairly qualified health centers and the urban and need health centers, that the people who receive services there can get a referral directly to our practice group. But we also have our general intake that's available statewide to everybody.
Great. That's really helpful. I guess what I'm wondering next, if there's anything that you might like to share with us, some final thoughts that you might have about some of the things that we've talked about in regards to legal services and housing and chronic illness. Anything else you might want to share?
Or anything that we didn't cover that you wanted to talk about?
That also.
Well, in preparation for this discussion, I was reviewing some research articles that different people who are doing research on medical legal partnerships and with housing. The survey data is showing that being able to secure housing, and sometimes with a legal intervention, is making differences in people's health. It's something that, I believe in my heart to be true, but there's actual survey data that is backing it up. There's been a couple of studies focusing on veterans and legal services provided through the Veterans Administration. There was a 2-year study in New York and Connecticut through the VA healthcare, and it found where vets received, MLP services related to housing, it led to an increase in the days that they stayed housed. And this was specifically focusing on actually veterans who were homeless or at risk of homelessness. But MLP services increased the days that they were housed and decreased the days that they were unhoused. But also over the course of a year, these vets saw a decrease in symptoms of anxiety, depression, hostility, paranoia, psychosis, PTSD, and substance abuse. So, it's kind of connecting, the legal service or intervention to the increase in housing, which is, leading to a measurable improvement in mental health symptoms or behaviors. That's one example, but there's more things like that I could share with you guys. But what I'd like to see more sort of research on that, and if we could do some sort of study in Montana, I'd love to see that sort of thing to kind of show some measurable health outcomes. But what we're seeing around the country is that it works.
The things that we've been talking about really emphasize to me how integrated everything is to positive outcomes, right? We tend in our programs, diabetes, cardiovascular health, to really think about blood pressure and blood sugar and stuff like that, right? But those measures are intimately linked to stress and mental health, which impact the behaviors that we engage in or our ability to sleep. And those things are impacted by our environment, like whether we're able to be housed stably, whether our housing is adequate and safe so that we don't have, asthma or COPD exacerbations, whether our housing has accessibility so that if we have mobility issues, we're able to move around, right, safely and feel secure. And all of those things are related to all of the factors, all of the individuals, all the organizations that support those quality infrastructure, that socioeconomic environment or emotional environment, right? So when we think about chronic illness, arthritis or diabetes or asthma or cancer or cardiovascular health, et cetera, all of those disease states or illnesses are intimately tied to everything else. And this discussion has really emphasized that things that we may not think about can impact our ability to have health, like our access to legal services. So I really appreciated that.
Yeah.
No, that's exactly right. And I think it is a very complex web of connected issues. And we've focused on housing perhaps for our discussion, but our practice is general in terms of the services that we provide. And something that I guess I want to emphasize is that supporting housing can support many other factors of somebody's life and vice versa. So supporting other social determinants of health can support stable housing, and all of this then is connected to health in a way that I believe can be causal, or at least it's correlative. But if we take the person with diabetes as an example, right? Somebody, might show up at the clinic and their blood pressure is high or is low, or their blood sugars are spiking or peaking or dropping for different reasons, and you might try to deal with it medically. But maybe it turns out this person is going through a divorce, which is enormously stressful. And so they are, not eating very well, right? Or maybe this person has lost their SNAP benefits. So they've lost, their income that they would be spending on food. Or maybe, like you said, there's a transportation issue. So they live out in the woods. So they can't, drive to the grocery store or something like that. Or maybe they're being evicted, which again could be enormously stressful, which has an effect of itself. But maybe they have to move someplace and kind of start over on their life, right? And they have to find a different way to get to the doctor, or they have to find a new grocery store, or they have to find a new pharmacy, and or there's a disruption in their income, right? For any of these things, and so it all kind of comes together, and the idea being that we try not to think of people and issues in silos, right? But every person is a whole person that is alive 24/7, that has things happening to them all the time, and these things are all related.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. You used a phrase earlier. You talked about cascading problems, which is sort of what you're referencing here, that one thing can really lead to another, and it is a web. Likewise, I'm thankful that Montana Legal Services Association is here, because there needs to be a place where people can turn. And just as easily as things can cascade into a bad place, I believe they can climb upwards also. By fixing one problem, you have the strength and ability to kind of get to the next. So it goes both ways. And I also appreciate you sharing some data here in the public health world. Sometimes data is not very interesting to some people, but I think we all need to know what those numbers are, and to be able to show people, validate some of those things, that it's useful and it's really necessary often to back up what we sort of know intuitively. So I appreciate that too. Thank you so much on behalf of Trina and myself and the crew behind the scenes. Thanks also to our guest, Robert Belle, whose work protects Montanans' legal determinants of health. If you would like more information on what was discussed today, visit our website at talkinghealthinthe406.mt.gov, where there will be links to the information discussed. And if you haven't already, please remember to rate, review, and subscribe to our podcast. And until next time, be healthy and be well.